Well, hello, how is everyone? I hope you're all well. You're amazing, beautiful, wonderful people. I hope you are having a fantastic 4th of July weekend. I hope you're not drinking too much. You're looking absolutely amazing. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. But anyway, let's get straight into the meat and potatoes oh my word. Look, in the aftermath of Bryan Kohberger pleading guilty, it has sent a few people haywire. One of them, Howard Blumberbus, he's back on it. So we read what Howard Blumberbus has to say, because he's talking about the call to Bryan Kohberger's family. And it then brings you back into this guilty plea. Why would Bryan Kohberger plead guilty? Now, obviously, he could plead guilty for many reasons. One of them being he's guilty. He is just guilty of this crime. Now, because of how quickly this happened, from our perspective, it might not have been from his perspective, from our perspective, so quick, doesn't really make sense. The prosecutors seemingly throwing the towel in seemed a little bit bizarre as well. Quoting an out-of-date and irrelevant PCA during the plea deal hearing also was weird. It was bizarre. But he could have also pleaded guilty to protect his family. Perhaps his family knew, or his father knew, and he didn't want them to be pulled into the fray and potentially face charges themselves. We've seen what has happened in the laundry situation in the aftermath of Gabby Petito dying. So look, things can happen. It can all get a little bit out of hand, and maybe it was to protect his family in that sense. However, what we have heard in an upcoming James Patterson book is that Bryan Kohberger's father would seemingly suggest that the knife sheath had been planted. And hopefully in that book, which I will be getting, we will hear more details around this specific situation. But stick a pin in that and just keep that in the back of your mind while we go through this from Howard Bloom, who seems to suggest that the 6 a.m. call to his father is something else. But again, so keep that in your mind, what we've just spoken about. So it says, Bryan Kohberger's 6 a.m. phone call that changed everything, revealed to Howard Blumberbus. I like how they word that. Changed everything, revealed to Howard Blum. The grieving families of 4 University of Idaho college students savagely murdered in 2022, and indeed most of America was shocked when it was reported Monday that the accused killer, Bryan Kohberger, had accepted a plea deal to live out the rest of his life in prison. 2 days later, the emotionless killer appeared in Boise, Idaho courtroom, where he verbally admitted his guilt on all counts. But beyond the justifiable outrage over the state prosecutor's deeply cynical yet pragmatic decision to put an accused murderer behind bars, many were left wondering, why now? I, however, was not particularly surprised. I had been reporting on this case in the days immediately after the killings in Moscow, Idaho, spending weeks in that tiny, traumatized college town, crossing America to the small Pennsylvania Lake community where Kohberger was born and raised, and sitting in court as state prosecutors battled Kohberger's savvy and determined court-appointed defense team. Really? Were they savvy and determined? Don't seem so. It became apparent to me early on that Kohberger's lawyers understood that the evidence against their client was convincing, even overwhelming. There was no getting around the fact that a touch of Kohberger's DNA was recovered from a knife she found on the bed of one of the victims. It also would have been near impossible for them to explain why his car was near the house where the murders occurred at approximately the time of the killings, and why he has no alibi on that freezing cold evening. Again, we're speculating a little bit here. It hadn't been proven to be his car, and you could argue that it had actually been considered to be a car that was different to his by the FBI specialist. But let's just carry on. As I report for the Daily Mail in April, Kohberger's attorneys had been lobbying him to accept a plea deal, taking the threat of execution by an Idaho firing squad, an antiquated method of capital punishment brought back into practice for Kohberger's benefit, off the table. So when you consider all this, right, that they had brought this methodology of death back in specifically for Kohberger, you would think that Idaho would want to go ahead and use it. They would be, fuck Bryan Kohberger, we don't care how he feels. We know that they'd argued trying to get the death penalty off the table multiple times, so why did they all of a sudden sack it off? But look, as a source close to the family told me then, It was his mother, Mary Ann, who repeatedly encouraged him to plead not guilty, frustrating the defence team's strategy. The mother's apparent motivation is still unclear, whether she was driven by a desire to protect her family reputation, like her family's reputation wasn't already fucked. So I doubt that was the point, or a delusional refusal to accept reality. My source said she stood in the way of a bargain with prosecutions. But we know there wasn't a deal with prosecutions. We know that the team had consistently approached trying to get the death penalty removed. So, fuck no. Look. In fact, the Kohberger family was allegedly so resistant to a deal that Bryan's lawyers argued in court that he had autism spectrum disorder and that executing someone with the condition would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. If the guy's got it, he's got it. You know, that was a ruse, I believe. So you're now saying that he didn't have it and it was all a lie? Who knows? I suspect the defence's true objective was to establish Kohberger's alleged autism so that they could argue the disorder made him incapable of making reasonable decisions, and therefore, despite his reluctance, they would ask the court to accept his guilty plea regardless of his consent, with the hope that in return the state will forego the death penalty and accept the life sentence. But now, my source tells me, it was only in the past few days that Bryan Kohberger's resistance to the deal was broken. Defense lawyers allegedly went back to Kohberger recently and warned him that if he goes to trial, his mother, father, Michael, and possibly even one of his two sisters would be called to testify. A recent Dateline investigation, of which I took part, revealed that there are records of a phone call that Kohberger made to a cell phone registered to his father at 6 a.m. on the morning after the murders. Is it possible that Kohberger spoke to his mother in that conversation and Kohberger was warned, I'm told, that the state will likely grill her over what may have been said? The defense team then assured Kohberger, my source said, that prosecutor would also undoubtedly question his father over the cross-country road trip they took together in December after Michael drove from Pennsylvania to pick up Bryan and take him back home in Pennsylvania for the Christmas holidays. Again, this trip was pre-arranged, however. We know that. By this time, there was a nationwide search for a killer, and while driving in Bryan's Hyundai Elantra, the Kohbergers were stopped twice by police but ultimately allowed to drive on. I was told that Bryan seemed distraught during the drive and confided in his father during that trip that he was in trouble at his job as a teaching assistant in the Criminal Justice Department at Washington State University. His father was quite possibly putting two and two together and concluding that his son was running from something terrible. Again, remember what we said, keep a pin in at the beginning, which was about the knife sheath being planted. Is it... I wouldn't imagine that if that was the case, if that was a conversation that was had later, that we would now be here, or how would Bryan Kohberger have known that a knife sheath was planted there, unless he knew he dropped it and was preempting that was going to come out. Finally, I've previously reported that one of Kohberger's sisters had confronted her father over her suspicions after she found her brother cleaning out his car and bizarrely sorting his garbage into garbage bags across their neighborhood while he was home in December. Some have speculated that Kohberger may have done that to hide trace DNA that might have left his refuse from investigators seeking to link him to the killings. All of this would be explored by prosecutors at trial, and a source close to the family says that influenced Bryan's decision to accept the deal. So there we go. This is what we're saying. So it says, of course, there's no way of knowing how prominent that was in his thoughts. The defense also recently suffered a series of losses in court. Judge Stephen Hippler threw out Kohberger's team's so-called alternative perpetrator defense theory, which suggests that 4 people were involved in the killing. Hippler also rejected the defense's attempt to claim that Kohberger didn't need to establish an alibi because he was out driving by himself in the early morning hours before the murders. So what finally pushed Kohberger to accept the plea deal, condemning himself to life in prison? It may be a combination of many factors, from his failing courtroom hopes to pressure from family. Or is it fear of his family being brought into into question? Who knows? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you all in the next one.